Hey everybody, I'm Rob Childs, a Rapier swordsman out of the United States, and today's video is coming from a question from one of the YouTube viewers out there asking me about what is the ideal balance of a rapier. So before I get into my own preferences, let's talk a little bit about why that balance is important. Now, at some point in time, you have probably seen a movie or you watched a TV show that had sword fighting in it, and they were talking about the balance of the sword. Now, in reality, the balance of your weapon, depending upon whether it is a thrust-centric weapon or a cutting-centric weapon, is very important about where that lies along the length of your sword. Now, coming from a rapier swordsman's perspective, since the rapier itself is a thrust-centric weapon, it is very important that the balance of the sword is actually closer to the hand rather than farther away. And the reason for that is so. If you had it too far away, then every time you're trying to move the sword, you are fighting the weight of that blade because of the fact that it is so top-heavy, as it were, that you're going to fight the momentum of that blade, and then you're going to fight it every single time that you're trying to stop it. It slows you down overall in the execution of the moves that you are trying to do. And when you're talking about rapier combat, where the response times and the actions that's happening across that fencing bout are happening literally across fractions of a second, everything that you do that slows you down, even by just a fraction, is a huge amount of time that you're giving to your opponent in return. So when you're talking about rapiers in general, you're going to want to have that balance point be closer to the guard rather than farther away. It's a thrust-centric weapon, and it's very important that you have that kind of quickness and control in your own weapon. Now for me, I prefer the balance to be within 1 to 3 inches depending on my own. Now in this particular sword here, you will find that this sword balances pretty well right about 3 inches in front of the guard. Now, why is that important? The reason for that is because the balance point of the sword when it comes to rapier combat needs to be your point of rotation. If you are fighting your weapon and trying to move it along anything other than that balance point in your sword, then what happens is you're fighting the weapon as you move it along. Sure, you can move it, and you can probably move it fairly quickly, but I'm telling you right now, it's not going to move as quickly as moving it along the actual balance point of the sword. So as you can see here, as I mentioned, my sword balance is 3 inches in front of the guard. When I do any parry whatsoever, I will move it around that point. Now you'll notice I can maneuver this sword and move it around fairly easily with just fingertips here because of the fact that I'm moving it around the balance point. But let's say, for example, I was not moving it around that balance point. Well, now it would take a little bit more strength, a little bit more control on my end in order to move this sword around, rather than the very little amount of effort it takes in order to move it when it's balanced perfectly and you're moving it around that point of balance. It is not only your balance point, it is your center of rotation. If you move your sword around that point, you're always going to be moving it as quickly and efficiently as you possibly can. Everything that you do that cuts down on the amount of time that you give to your opponent is advantage in your favor. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can adjust that balance if it's not quite where it is to your liking. So there's a couple of different ways. Obviously, the blade itself is something that you can buy that some blades are going to be lighter, some are going to be heavier. I myself prefer a heavier blade, but that's for purposes of being able to really muscle and impart a great deal of authority over my opponent's weapons. But that does have an effect on where the balance of the sword is. So if you're like me and you prefer a heavier blade, but you still want to have a good balance point that's close to the guard, other options that you have are to change the pommel out. You can have lighter or heavier pommels. If that's not really an option for you, you can also take the pommel off and insert aluminum washers, copper washers. Different metals are going to have different weights, and therefore it's going to pull or push that balance point of your sword closer or farther away from the bell itself. So I highly encourage you to experiment away. Find out what feels right to you, what works best. If you want something that's really a balance point that's really close to the guard of your sword, that's great. I myself prefer one that's a little bit farther away. You might find that to be of equal use to you. But if you have any questions about that, I'm not hard to get a hold of. Please feel free to reach out to me on the YouTube channel. For those of you Patreon supporters, you of course know how you can get a hold of me. And of course, you can reach me through Facebook as well. I'm not hard to get a hold of. So I hope you all found this video to be of use. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I am more than happy to help where I can.